We are now 2 weeks away from Germany's next federal election, and in this video I want to take a look and give a general overview of the polls in the country to see what we can expect the results to be in 2 weeks' time on election day. Now, of course, there's been a lot of talk and discussion within Germany revolving around the CDU-CSU's proposed migration bill, which they indirectly worked with the AfD to submit an application to the Bundestag for. Now, of course, the law in itself did not end up passing through the Bundestag. However, the fact that there was at least a small level of indirect cooperation between the CDU-CSU and the FDP and the AfD was a big deal, because before that had been a big taboo in German politics. All of the parties had ruled out working with the AfD, not just forming a coalition, but any kind of cooperation with the party. And since then, there's been a lot of pushback, a lot of protests, particularly from left-wing forces, the SPD, the Greens, activists, and their supporters against both the CDU-CSU and the AfD for this decision. Now, of course, Friedrich Merz has ruled out working with the AfD in any kind of a coalition or a minority government, but nonetheless, this move was seen as very controversial and was heavily criticized by members of the SPD, the Greens, and the Bundestag, and there was, like I said, widespread protests against the CDU-CSU for this decision. However, the actual effect of this on the election has been yet to be seen. There are some polls that have shown the CDU losing a point, some polls that have shown them gaining a point, and overall there has not been a wide effect on the election by this result. It's been around a week since I did that video, and there's been kind of a lot of polls that have come out since that decision, since that happened, and there has been some shift, but it's not really too significant to say that this is going to be impact the election by a large amount. We still have 2 weeks to go, so we still have, of course, the debates. There's a lot of time for things to happen. So we could see some of these parties shift a few points, but the actual, cooperation revolving the CDU and the AfD in the Bundestag over the migration bill and the reaction to it. There was a heated debate in the Bundestag. There's lots of protests that are still going on now, but whether or not that will actually affect the election by, a large amount is yet to be seen. And according to polls, we can say that that is not the case. Now, if we take a look at the polls overall, we can see that really not much has changed over the past several weeks and months, with the exception of some changes with Die Linke and the BSV, which I will get to after talking about the other parties. Now, the CDU-CSU, led by Friedrich Merz, is still on top at around 30%. Now, they have fallen below 30% in the aggregate, which is somewhat significant. This is kind of somewhat a bad sign for the CDU-CSU in some states and some state elections. For example, in Hessen, and for example, in some of the polls for North Rhine-Westphalia, they've been able to break over 30, around 34, 35%. And there was a possibility that Merz, being in the opposition and being the kind of party that was the most viable position to take over from the SPD, there were some polls putting them at around 32, 33%. And I did expect that it was possible for the CDU to break past their 2017 margin and get maybe around 32, 33, maybe 34% of the vote. But it's clear that, Merz's personal popularity has not been able to, carry the CDU to a much higher number, above that 30% ceiling. And it looks like now that is pretty much the case. The CDU-CSU, of course, is in first place by around 10 points. They are the largest party by far. And Friedrich Merz himself, even despite this, the backlash after his recent decision to, work on this bill, of course, with minor cooperation with the AfD, it's very certain, almost, very likely that he will become chancellor. I don't see really any other party that's in a position to put the chancellor forward as of now. Now, of course, the cooperation and the coalition agreements that will happen after the election, likely between the CDU-CSU and the SPD and the Greens, will, of course, probably be more difficult because Merz decided to try and push through that bill with support of the AfD. However, I think in the end, it is likely that a CDU-CSU SPD government or a CDU-CSU Green government will end up being formed, and of course, with Friedrich Merz being the next chancellor of Germany. So the CDU-CSU, they're in a dominant, strong position because of the division, because of the way the political field is divided between so many parties, and they are doing better than they did in 2021. They are recovering a lot of the losses, but they are not, clearly doing as good as I think they had hoped to, or as good as they were kind of doing a few months and even, around a year ago. If we take a look at the AfD, they're at around 20%. They have, maintained a clear, number above 20% in the polling aggregate. So this was a very significant for the party. This would be a major milestone. They got 10% in the last election. This would be a doubling of their result, and this would of course mean a faction in the Bundestag that is twice as big. This would mean that the AfD would have a huge impact on German politics, and they would be a very strong opposition, even though it's highly unlikely, almost 100% certain that the AFD will not be part of any government. The AFD will be able to form with this 20%. Be technically leading the opposition. They will be one of the major parties. They'll have a lot more speaking time. They will, of course, have a lot more money, a lot more positions in not only the Bundestag itself, but in the different committees. And so they will be a powerful opposition force in Germany. The SPD and the Greens are in third and fourth place. The SPD, of course, the party of Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is at around 16%. They have been lingering from around 13 to 17% for several months. I mean, pretty much over a year now. And this being, the party of the chancellor, not only in, 15 points behind the person in the party in first place, but also being in third place, is definitely a major problem for the SPD. And if they end up, getting anything close to this in the election, this is going to be a disaster for the SPD. And they will probably have, major leadership changes, major, have to ask the party like major internal questions after this result, because something like this for a party like the SPD, which has been a, major party in German politics for since the entire existence of the Federal Republic, is going to be a major deal. The Greens are expected to maybe lose a few points, but the Green Party is much newer. The last election they got around 14.8%, so if they lose a point, it will be set back. It will show that they have lost a lot of the momentum they've had in the past several years, and it will definitely be a disappointing result. But they will still be able to put themselves forward as a coalition partner. They will still be able to rebuild in the future. But the SPD, more is expected from the SPD than 16%, because the SPD commands, I believe, 6 or 7 governors in Germany. The Greens, of course, command 1, and so the SPD is a more experienced, more veteran party. It has more time in German politics. It's more developed. It has more infrastructure. And so for the SPD to be at 16% is a much, much worse thing than any other for the Greens to be at 13%. And I will say, of course, the one advantage the SPD does have is they do have Olaf Scholz as the incumbent chancellor. Now, I think that whether or not the SPD is able to recover will highly depend on whether or not Olaf Scholz can kind of convince German voters that he is more viable than Friedrich Merz as a person. I don't think the SPD party in this position is going to be able to beat the CDU. I think it's all basically, Scholz has to run the perfect campaign for the next 2 weeks, and Merz has to blunder and make all the gaffes possible. And I think maybe then you could see the SPD recover to over 20% and close the gap. But still, a 15-point gap between these two parties makes it almost certain that Olaf Scholz has no chance of becoming the next chancellor, or remaining as chancellor, and Friedrich Merz is almost guaranteed the position. Like I said, this result for the Greens is going to be a setback. This is going to be loss of momentum, but this will be slightly better than the EU election results, and I think they will be okay with this result of around anywhere from 12 to 14, 15%. Now, what's interesting is over the past several days and weeks, the polls have actually showed an increase in support from Die Linke. Now, Die Linke got less than 3% in the EU elections back in June of 2024. In the 2021 federal election, they fell below the 5% threshold narrowly, getting only 4.9%. And so it was expected that Die Linke was pretty much guaranteed to fall below 5% and would have to rely on winning 3 direct mandates to get into the Bundestag. But a lot of polls recently have shown that the Die Linke has actually crossed over the 5% in the polling aggregate. Now, Die Linke did underperform in 2021. Most of the polls back then were saying that they would get around 6-7%, and they only got around 4.9%. So it is possible the polls could be off, and of course, in the aggregate, they were only around 5%. And of course, you want to be, clearly above this by a few points in order to, know for sure that they're going to be in. And so I wouldn't say for sure that Die Linke is going to make 5%, but this is of course a good sign for the party. They're going to want to, to at least have the option to either win the 3 direct mandates, but of course, if they lose one of those seats, then they would like to have the option to win actually with the 5% way to win proportional representation. And so I would say Die Linke now has a lot better chance to win representation in the Bundestag. They have 2 options: either win the 5% or the 3 direct mandates. And of course, they are connected. If they are getting 1-2 points more overall nationwide, then in some of the districts where they are much stronger, they could be getting, of course, more momentum too. So good sign for Die Linke. It's I would say that the chance of them remaining in the Bundestag is I would say at least above 50% as of now, much higher than it was even a few weeks ago. And so that is, of course, a good sign for the party, but they are only at 5.1%, and they still have a lot of work to do. And of course, this is with this number, they could easily also fall below and only win 2 seats. And like I said, if they win only 2 direct mandates and 4.999% of the vote, they will not win any seats. And so everything it matters a lot how much this if they are able to actually reach this margin, because they will not be able to win any of these 38 seats if they do not meet both one or both of the quotas. that is required. Now, interestingly enough, the BSV has kind of trended in the opposite direction. In the EU elections, they received around 6.2% of the vote. Now, much of the polls early on when the BSV was founded were, of course, overstating the party's support. This was largely due to the enthusiasm the party had. Of course, German politics doesn't have as many new parties as some countries, such as Italy or maybe France do. And so I think a lot of voters were enthusiastic and excited about the prospect of a new party entering German politics. And there were probably a lot of maybe center-left voters from the SPD or voters from the AfD who were interested in voting for the BSV and answering to the polls and surveys, but ended up coming back home to their to their original parties. And so we saw the BSV kind of decline in the polls. However, at the EU elections, they were able to cross around 6%, and so I think it was assumed by many people that they would be able to do that at the Bundestag election, at least getting over 5% of the vote. However, in the polling aggregate, in a lot of polls, they are reaching only around 4%. So I would say that the BSV is in a very dangerous situation right now. It is, of course, very possible for them to cross over 5%. The polls could be understating them. And so I think Die Linke and the BSV both have, the equal chance of getting into the Bundestag or not. It is still up in the air for both of these parties, and they will probably have to do everything they can in these last 2 weeks in the campaign to make sure they ended up getting in. But of course, the political survival of both of these parties is on the line because, of course, the BSV and Die Linke aren't the same party. They aren't, they don't have all the same positions, but they did, the BSV did split away from Die Linke. And so there is going to be a kind of desire, I believe, for both parties to see the other one kind of, cease to exist in the German political spectrum so they don't have to share the political space on the left. Of course, they are both kind of redefining the left. The BSV, one of the BSV leaders had, classified them as conservative left, and Die Linke is more of a progressive left-wing party. However, they have, the same roots. They have a lot of the same, of course, a lot of the politicians for the BSV in the Bundestag right now, all of them, in fact, are from Die Linke. And so there is, of course, a lot of tension between the two groups because Die Linke sees the BSV at, the BSV's foundation as a betrayal. They lost their faction status in the Bundestag because of the 10 defectees. And so I would say that Sarah Wagner is going to want to see her party get in and most likely Die Linke fail and cease to exist and be able to kind of take the rest of those voters and, of course, have the rest of them go to the Greens of the SPD. And, of course, Die Linke is going to want to see a party that they see as, saw as traitors, as a party that betrayed them, also fail. And so I think that, I don't think the Bundestag is going to be able to, I don't think that both of these parties can really survive. I think that one or the other is probably going to end up winning out in the end. Of course, up until now, the BSV was much stronger. The BSV beat Die Linke in all of their strongholds in East Germany and was able to be bigger in all of them, including Thuringia, where Die Linke had a governor. And so, even if both parties enter in the Bundestag in this election, I think eventually within a few years, one of these parties will kind of cease to exist as a major federal player. But who that will be is, of course, still up in the air. And of course, if Die Linke or the BSV fail to enter in the Bundestag, they'll of course be a political party that with representation in state legislatures and local government and local, city councils. However, it is very possible that political parties, including also the FDP, if they do not win above 5% of the vote, if they fall below the threshold, they could, not be able to gain the momentum and relevance in German politics, and they could end up in a position like the Free Voters where they are marginalized to being a regional party in a few states and no longer have a major impact on German politics. And that is significant because the FDP has been around since the foundation of the German Federal Republic. Die Linke is a staple of German politics. And the BSV, of course, is much new, but is also a splinter group from Die Linke. Sarah Wagner is one of the most well-known politicians in Germany that's been on many talk shows, interviews, and debates. And so for any of these parties to cease to exist from German politics would be a very significant development and a very big change for anyone who's followed German politics recently or of course, also for the past several years. So here we have the polling situation. As of now, not too much has changed aside from the kind of shift in with Die Linke and the BSV, but of course these are only polls. We don't know what will happen in the end. Now I want to take a quick look at the coalitions that are possible. Now, like I said, the CDU-CSU is going to be in prime position to form the next government, and they have basically, obviously, three mathematical oppositions. The CDU and the AfD could form a coalition. It is mathematically possible, and because the CDU-CSU and the AfD work together on the migration bill, I would say, of course, it is important to still mention that this is a possibility, but as of now, it is almost uncertain. Almost 100% not going to happen. The CDU-CSU has maintained they are not going to work with the AFD. And even in states where the AFD has more leverage, in the East German states, the CDU, CSU, and the AFD have not cooperated together, even on a minority government level. So this happening at the federal level, I would say, is still something that's going to be kind of out of the question and not really going to happen. It is mathematically possible, but as of now, I'd say this is very unlikely to happen. Now we have the other two options, which is that either Merz leads the government as chancellor with the SPD or with the Greens. It is possible if the BSV, the FDP, and the Die Linke end up getting in, then we could see the SPD and the CDU and the SPD, or the CDU and Greens falling short, not having enough seats in the Bundestag, and then we could see a bigger coalition required to win the majority between the CDU, CSU, SPD, and Greens, including all three parties. And I think that is possible, but as of now, of course, the polls are showing that with the current constellation of the Bundestag, only one coalition partner will be needed for the CDU-CSU. I suspect the SPD will be the likely one. The SPD and the Greens have ruled together before, in German politics, going back decades, on and off, and also in a lot of state governments have worked together. And I think that, of course, the CDU and the Greens have increasingly worked together over the past, several decades. However, there's been a lot of criticism, especially from the CSU in Bavaria, over any cooperation with the CDU and the Greens. And so I think that the internal, party members and party leadership of the CDU, even though in states like Hessen and in North Rhine-Westphalia, we see, Hessen previously, we saw coalitions between the CDU and Greens. I think that as of now, a CDU-SPD coalition is more likely and going to be more favorable towards, for CDU party members. And I think for that reason, they're going to pressure, Merz to work with the SPD rather than the Greens. And of course, like I said, the coalition talks are probably going to be somewhat more difficult because of Merz's decision to try and push the migration bill. But in the end, I think that the most likely outcome, in my opinion, would be a CDU, SPD, CDU, CSU, SPD grand coalition with Friedrich Merz as the chancellor. Lastly, I want to take a look at the Chancellor approval rating polls between Olaf Scholz and Friedrich Merz. Now, of course, the two have their first debate tonight, and this could be somewhat important because if Olaf Scholz is able to perform very well and Merz makes a lot of mistakes, we could see the SPD maybe recover from their 15-point deficit. I think the SPD is pretty much too far behind at this point to guarantee Scholz, winning back the chancellorship. However, if it's going to happen, Scholz has to pretty much prove to German voters that he is a more viable candidate than Friedrich Merz, and as of now, most of the polls are showing that Scholz is behind Merz. Merz himself is not that popular and below 50%, but as of now, Scholz is less liked than Merz. And I think that if Scholz is able to prove in the debates and also in the campaign in the last 2 weeks that he is more viable and a better candidate than Friedrich Merz, even the SPD's 15-point deficit behind the CDU will be able to shrink some. And I think that Scholz could be able to win back a few points for the SPD off of his personal popularity if it's able to become stronger than Friedrich Merz. Now, we have only 2 weeks left in the campaign. There'll be some other debates, of course, with the other candidates, with Robert Habeck from the Greens and Alice Weidel from the AFD. I do not expect Olaf Scholz to be able to pull it off, but the debates are just one way that maybe the SPD could recover a few points. But I think pretty much in order for Merz to not be chancellor, he has to make all the mistakes, and Scholz almost has to have a perfect storm and perfect performance at every debate and have almost the rest of the campaign go flawlessly for him to have a chance of becoming chancellor, or remaining as chancellor, rather. So that's going to be it for this video. If you guys like, please do like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.